For those of you who've been looking for Season 1 of Solarpunk Presents, but haven't been able to find it, here it is. Originally, it was published as part of Solarpunk Magazine's Solarpunk Futures podcast. We're reposting our episodes on our site to make them easier for you to listen to if you didn't catch them the first time. We hope you enjoy them. Also, don't forget to support us by spreading the word about Solarpunk Presents, writing us a review, or subscribing to our Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents. Hello and welcome to Solarpunk Presents, the companion podcast to Solarpunk Futures. Hosted by Solarpunk Magazine nonfiction editors extraordinaire Ariel, Kroon, and Christina Rocha. Ariel and I will be using this companion podcast to Solarpunk Futures to explore solarpunk goings-on in the world today. We'll be interviewing all sorts of interesting people who are doing work in the here and now that will help us get to a solarpunk future. And we'll be talking to each other about the visions of a sustainable, equitable future integral to solarpunk, and about issues we're curious about within the movement or genre, or whatever it is you want to call solarpunk. Hello and welcome to episode 6, which will be hosted by Ariel Kroon.
Today, I'm talking to Justine Norton-Kertson, who is the co-editor-in-chief and founder of Solarpunk Magazine. And I'll be talking to them today about their upcoming book, Bioluminescent, a Lunarpunk Anthology. Okay, so Justine, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah, I'm excited to sit down and talk. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm very keen to do this interview about your upcoming book, Bioluminescent, a Lunarpunk Anthology. Since I'm actually not super familiar with Lunarpunk, I don't know that it's something most people know about, even if they're into more solarpunk literature. I know of it as the yin to solarpunk's yang, but beyond some very beautiful artworks and really neat fashion ensembles that I've seen, I haven't really encountered very much of Lunarpunk, so I'm really stoked for you to elaborate on that for me today and for our listeners.
Great.
Yeah. So you're publishing a Lunarpunk anthology, and I do want to talk to you about the nitty-gritty details of that in a bit, if you can share. But first, could you describe to me in your own words what Lunarpunk is?
Ooh, yeah, no. I mean, I will try. I'm hesitant just because it's such a new genre that's part of the point of the anthology, at least from my perspective, is to sort of like as a science fiction, punk subgenre community kind of figure out what it is. It's been out there for a number of years. It's not like brand new. I would say less than a decade. And it's essentially, up until this point, it's basically been, there's a few spots on the internet. I think there's a spot there's like a Lunarpunk anarchist site, and maybe like, I think the Solarpunk Druid site has some stuff on Lunarpunk, right? So there's some of these folks who have like started staking out mostly aesthetic territory for Lunarpunk, right? Like instead of, reds and yellows and oranges and greens, like Solarpunk, it's blacks and silvers and purples and, glowy neon type colors, and it's more gothic than Solarpunk is sort of more Art Nouveau, or even sometimes kind of more like on the green brutalist spectrum. So that's and then it's essentially kind of been defined loosely as like a subgenre of solarpunk that is somewhat of an opposite, right? But that's very like a very loose concept, right? Like, is it solarpunk at night or solarpunk on the moon, or is it the more sort of spiritual side of solarpunk, or what, right? And so the anthology, through the stories, sort of addresses that.
Oh, cool.
But without actually making an answer either, right? I mean, there are stories that sort of come from all of them. There are stories that take place in outer space and on space stations. And there are stories that take place in glowy forests and are all about like pagan future communities and stuff like that. Like it kind of brings it all in. So it doesn't answer the question, but it furthers the conversation, maybe.
Yeah, for an evolving genre, it sounds like this is really sort of the perfect, well, not starting point, but as you said, contribution to the conversation that's furthering those ideas. And I'm very excited to see where it goes with that.
Yeah, me too. One thing I would say before we move on to another question, though, about in terms of the definition, though, is that Lunarpunk is definitely related to Solarpunk and is a subgenre and has sort of always been thought of that way. And so, I mean, I still think of like the core root of a Lunarpunk story being similar to that of Solarpunk, right? Being about solutions and building a utopia, and in particular solving climate crisis, and then exploring what the future looks like once that problem has been solved.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I was just actually about to ask you that. Like, does Lunarpunk reflect the sort of ideology of Solarpunk, and what can we see in common between the two? Is there anything that's extremely disparate between the two? As you said, it's an evolving genre, and so I don't expect you to have like a straightforward, hard and solid line that you're drawing between the two. But that's just sort of something that's coalescing right now, as I get that feeling. Yeah.
And I mean, there's definitely that similarity. There's definitely a difference in the two in the aesthetic, like I was talking about, right? Sort of the darker Gothic type aesthetic of Lunarpunk versus the more sort of I don't know, bright aesthetic of Solarpunk. Other than that, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot to say. I mean, as Lunarpunk and as Solarpunk continues to develop as genres, there might be more differences that emerge. I know within the whole really weird, awkward, gung-ho not gun-ho, but like gung-ho pro NFT side of the whole Solarpunk world, which is really difficult to understand in the first place. But there's this whole, I ran into this on Twitter a couple weeks ago, this whole like strain of NFT crypto Lunarpunk that is developing in response to the Solarpunk NFT crypto weirdness that's going on. And they're like,
so interesting.
You know, it is. And it is interesting to watch, even though, I mean, it's all problematic in terms of environmental impact with blockchain and NFTs and all of that. But
it's interesting, like as an outsider observer to sort of like see the burgeoning of these new genres in different, very different places, and the sort of taking up of this aesthetic by very different people with very different ideologies, which is interesting to me because, I think Solarpunk has a little bit more of a definitive ideology at this point, even though it's still quite new. And politics that go along with it, whereas Lunarpunk is still very, it is still starting with that aesthetic, and we can extrapolate from that aesthetic. I certainly have. But I'm excited to read this anthology that will sort of give me more of an idea of how other people are thinking about what to extrapolate from this aesthetic. So I wanted to ask you actually, and this might be a bit in the same vein, but what prompted you to put together a Lunarpunk anthology? Because you are the co-editor-in-chief and founder of Solarpunk Magazine, so it seems a bit of a contrast. You're the Solarpunk person, so
right. Yeah, and I actually started by beginning the process of putting together a Solarpunk anthology, and I've got a co-editor who I've been working on that with. It started out being called Solarpunk Sunscapes. I'm not sure that that's what the title is going to end up being, but that Solarpunk anthology got picked up by a larger press. I don't think I'm at liberty to give the details at this point, but that sort of stretched the timeline for that anthology out, because like a lot of times, even with small presses, it can be a year, 2 years, 3 years from the time that you like sign a contract till when your book actually comes out. And so when it was just going to probably be done independently, it was going to come out in 2023. Now it's not going to be till 2024 probably. I was a little bit bummed that the timeline for that got stretched out, but it is what it is. And then sort of around the same time, I was really kind of digging into what had been written so far about Lunarpunk, and thought, well, hey, I'm doing a Solarpunk anthology. Why not do the flip side also and put together a Lunarpunk anthology? So, and then it just, turns out that the Lunarpunk one will come out first. But
actually, what sort of stories then could a reader expect to encounter in this Lunarpunk anthology? Could you give us a little bit of a sneak peek?
Yeah, sure. So without going into like detail about any of the stories, it's a good mix, I think, of science fiction and fantasy, and then sort of stories that kind of blend the two in like a science fantasy. So it's sort of diverse in that sense. And then, like I was mentioning earlier, the stories sort of take a number of different angles at defining or elucidating the meaning of Lunarpunk through the stories. So there's a couple stories that take place in space, one on a space station, and I think one on a ship, actually. And then there are a few stories that take place in like future kind of I don't know that they're you would call them spiritual communities. They're communities that have like a spiritual focus, among other things, and generally paganish. Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, there's sort of an assumption among the authors who are writing these stories that because Solarpunk and thus Lunarpunk is so sort of wrapped up in like the idea of creating harmony between humanity and nature, and that's very much in line with kind of the central one of at least the central themes of Wicca and like modern witchcraft. And so those stories that kind of look at the spiritual side of future Solarpunk communities generally sort of take that kind of pagan witchcraft path. Let's see what else. Then there are then there are a number of stories that just sort of are a little bit more like what you would expect out of a Solarpunk story, but then just with a different aesthetic layover onto it. So it's a good variation. But then also there's we've got some pretty nice big names too with the anthology. So we've got a story by Serena Ulibari, who is well known within the Solarpunk community and has put out a number of anthologies. Wendy Wagner, who is the editor-in-chief of Nightmare Magazine, which is really cool. And she has a interesting sort of dark noir, very light horror take on the idea of Lunarpunk. It's not like gory or, there's no like, big murder scenes or anything that you would expect out of horror, but it's very much has like a horror kind of vibe to it, which is interesting. And then we've got a novelette in the book that is about 11,000 words. That's one of the stories that looks at more kind of like the spiritual side of Solarpunk. And that's written by Starhawk. And then we have a story by Neil Gaiman too, which is, we were really lucky to get. And that story will actually kind of front end the book, as it doesn't necessarily hold the aesthetic that generally people are going for with Lunarpunk. And it was written years ago. It's a reprint of a story that he published some time ago, but that I suspect a lot of people haven't read. But it's a fantasy story that basically personifies non-human characters, and so I felt that because I had the story and was just kind of like trying to figure out what to do with it. And I really felt that it would go well at the beginning of the book, even though it's a little bit different in terms of the Lunarpunk itself, just because it sort of sets the stage for the book as something that's a little bit more on the fantasy and fantastic side, right? Because people who come to Solarpunk generally are expecting more of a science fiction story, and this, while that's certainly there, it very quickly becomes obvious that the stories venture, some of them pretty deeply into the realm of fantasy, and so I felt like the Neil Gaiman story one would, maybe give the book a little push. For one, but then also really sort of help set that framework up of sort of science fantasy as opposed to just science fiction.
I was going to ask you, how did you find authors? Like, was it difficult to find writers of Lunarpunk stories, or were you overwhelmed with submissions? Did you solicit people? What was kind of if I could ask, what was kind of the submissions process like?
It was a combination of the two. We did a public submission window and did get a lot of stories. I mean, probably not a lot of stories compared to like what some magazines get, especially like sort of generalist science fiction magazines. Some of the more popular ones get like hundreds, thousands of submissions, per month or per quarter or whatever. But we did get a good couple hundred submissions, which is good for such a niche project, because authors don't just have like any old story they could necessarily just throw at it or submit to it. So it was a lot to read through, and there were a lot, as always, a lot of good stories that easily could have made it in, but just didn't make it because something had to be cut. But then we also did solicit a few stories, mostly those three bigger names that I mentioned, Neil Gaiman and Serena Ulibarri and Wendy Wagner. But then there were one or two other stories. Maybe it's just one. There's a story in there by an author named Bright Flame that I spoke with her ahead of time and asked her to write one. And then the Starhawk one too was solicited. That story actually Starhawk wrote for the Lunarpunk issue that Solarpunk Magazine is doing, but she sent it to me and I wasn't expecting it. I knew she was writing a story, but it had like enough time had passed that I wasn't expecting it to come, and we had already gone through the submission process and sort of rounded out the issue. On top of that, it came in and it was like 4,000 or 5,000 words longer than what Solarpunk Magazine publishes. So we decided that it was just a great coincidence that the anthology was going to be publishing soon after, so we just put the story in that instead.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually, what is the pub date for this anthology?
So it publishes, it's not too far away actually, January 24th of this next year, 2023.
Wow, that's
it's coming right around the corner. We'll be starting to send the first arcs out this week.
Hello, the producer here, interrupting with a very important public service announcement. For those of you who are sitting here thinking, ARCs? Send out the first ARCs this week. What Justine means is advanced reader copies.
We'll be starting to send the first ARCs out this week. So that's exciting.
Yeah, I was going to ask that if you're able, could you pull the curtain back a bit on the development process sort of as it stands right now? But if you're sending out ARCs, my goodness, does that be done then, or?
Mostly, yeah. It still needs a final proofread, which generally advanced reader copies go out before that final proofread happens. But that, I mean, that's pretty much it. Yeah, I mean, the layout's done, the cover art's done. It's pretty much just a matter of getting the advanced copies out so that we can get reviews coming in ahead of the release date.
Oh wow, that's really exciting. Remind me, who's the press that's publishing it?
Yeah, it's Android Press, which is the same publisher that puts out Solarpunk Magazine.
Where can our listeners find out more about this upcoming anthology, Bioluminescent, or about Android Press, if they're interested?
Yeah, our website is android-press.com or hyphen, android-.com. How some people say it differently, dash or hyphen. But if you can just go there, there is a video right at the front of the homepage about the anthology, with a link to the Kickstarter, which actually starts. Well, I don't know when this is coming out, so maybe by the time people are hearing this, it won't be tomorrow. But from this perspective, it starts tomorrow, October 4th. And so yeah, that's really excited, which is essentially the beginning of pre-orders.
Wow.
Pre-orders with perks, yeah.
With perks. I am going to ask you about, or well, I was going to ask about those perks, but are people just going to have to go find out, or?
No, yeah, that's fine. We can talk about it. So obviously the book, you can get either ebook copies or print copies of the book. And then there are, let's see, so there's some like clothing, Lunarpunk related type stuff, a shirt that has the cover art for the book on it, and then a hat that has like a crescent moon, and it says Lunarpunk that is embroidered into the front of it. And then let's see, we've got like a book bag that includes that book, and then digital copies of the other books that Android Press has published so far, which is 2 additional books. And then there is a like a story critique package for people who are authors. Authors generally are also readers, and so for any authors who are looking to get the book through the Kickstarter, there's an option to also get a short story critique of one of their own stories, and basically things like that. Yeah.
Wow, that's really exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
So on this podcast, we ask our guests often about what kind of solarpunk future that they specifically would like to see or build towards, but let's twist that a bit. I want to ask you, what kind of Lunarpunk future would you like to see or come to pass?
Wow, that's a new one. That's a fun question. I see a future where, I mean, we all learn, I hope, but maybe not all of us. I'm sure some of us have parents with more questionable parenting methods, but most of us at least probably learn from our parents when we're growing up that sharing is a good thing and that it's important to share with people. And it seems like such a basic concept that feels like it is lost in our society when we, I don't know, hit puberty or become adults or whatever. We enter the world and we start working and paying bills, and all of a sudden sharing is not, it's not a good thing anymore, right? I mean, like, and it's not us. I don't mean to put it on individual people's shoulders. It's the system, and it's capitalism specifically that sort of instills this idea into us that there's not enough, there's just one pie and we've all got to get our slice of it, and you can't let anybody else have your slice because it's all you're probably going to get.
That scarcity mindset.
Yeah, exactly. And so that sort of like post-scarcity reality, I think, is an important couple, both of Solarpunk and Lunarpunk, and just a society that really is based on the idea that we share with each other, which too I think is maybe just sort of a mild way of saying socialism in a sense, right? I mean, just that nobody's going to go hungry, and the whole like each according to their need and from their ability kind of thing, right? That regardless of how much you're putting into the system, because there's more than enough for everyone, right, if not other reasons as well, nobody should ever be homeless or or not be able to get a meal for them or for their kids, or not have to go without medical attention, or any of these things that just seem so basic and obvious to some of us, but for some reason not all of us. But then more specifically on the Lunarpunk side, I'm interested in, well, a couple things. One, I'm really interested in the possibility of just sort of bioluminescent technology and like glowing plants as a future possibility for lighting our homes and our communities in ways that don't necessarily use electricity. Because I mean, even if all of our electricity is being produced in a healthy, green, environmentally conscious way, that doesn't mean that there will necessarily be unlimited amounts of it. And so finding ways that are interesting and cool and really pretty like that, that really add character to a place that we can also use in a very functional and practical way, I think is really interesting, and is a direction that the whole genetic modification thing, I think, could go. And then, I think that we need to be certainly wary about that. And I'm one of the people who is like wary of genetic modification of food and things like that, mostly because I get anxious about, like they build pesticides into vegetables and stuff, like into the genetic structure of vegetables.
The producer here breaking in again to say that what Justine is talking about are so-called Bt potatoes, Bt maize, and Bt sweet corn. These genetically modified crops contain genes from the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis, which produces a protein that is lethal to the larvae of butterflies and moths. This protein is called the Bt delta endotoxin, and it works against caterpillars of the European corn borer, which bores its way into maize plants, causing incredible destruction and reductions in crop yields. And now back to Ariel and Justine's conversation.
Like they build pesticides into vegetables and stuff, like into the genetic structure of vegetables. So, I mean, like, I don't necessarily have a problem with genetic modification in and of itself, but then like you do something like that, and then I feel like that's maybe even, and I'm not a scientist, so maybe it's not, but like it's potentially worse even than like spraying pesticides on vegetables, because at least I can wash the vegetable if it's been sprayed with something. But if like this what amounts to a poison is built into the genetic makeup of the vegetable, so that if a bug eats it, the bug dies, then how do I wash the genetics off of the vegetable when I want to eat it? This is sort of like another avenue that doesn't necessarily screw with our food, but that, and not to mention that there are just sort of like plants that have that capability out there already, plants and plankton. And
that sort of biomimicry, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, taking something.
And then also I'm interested in the kind of spiritual side, like I mean, I'm an atheist, and I don't believe in God, so I think it strikes people as a little odd, but there's a whole strain of paganism and witchcraft that is atheist and non-believer, that sort of looks at it more from, and looks at spirituality in general more from as sort of like a personal growth and like community building kind of thing. I don't want to say self-help because that's just so cheeky, but but like, a way to connect to people and build meaningful relationships in a way that goes deeper than just what we can necessarily explain, right? But that doesn't rely on belief in things that can't be scientifically explained, right?
I think it's been pretty obviously demonstrated that spirituality is very important to some people, and ritual and togetherness is also extremely important to human beings in general, and so that is very interesting as a way.
And I think churches and religions in general, not just churches, because they're that's specific to Christianity, but religious groups and spiritual groups, they throughout time, I guess, have seem to have like figured out somehow a way of like bringing together people in a way that is really deep and meaningful to them. And it's something that like other groups and like other attempts at forming group cohesion, like civic groups and things like that, just quite haven't figured out, right? Like people are dedicated to their churches, right? And a lot of it probably has to do with the belief and the faith aspect. But I would love, I mean, just in terms of like what better communities and better futures and what a Lunarpunk future might look like, this idea of a way for people to have those deep, meaningful connections, regardless of whether they are religious or not or believe in God, I think is really important, right? I mean, if you're going to have a community or a society that you would call utopia, then it seems like those sort of really strong community bonds and interpersonal bonds would be there and be important.
Yeah, I think that's important. And that's, spirituality, solarpunk spirituality. I mean, I think it naturally feels like it slides naturally into Lunarpunk, at least for me, in terms of the way that the aesthetic is sort of set up. It seems that is where a lot of these sort of more spiritual signifiers that we're familiar with, like the moon and all these different objects of significance, are represented. That's really, really, I think, crucial to think about, not just for like a genre of fiction, but also an ideology as well. So thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me. And I'm really looking forward to seeing Bioluminescent on digital shelves.
Yeah.
So where can our listeners find you online, Justine?
Yeah, I mostly am on Twitter at Jank, Jank Writes, Jank, WRITES, Jank Writes. And then, I mean, I'm on Instagram too with the same handle. So you can find me there, but I'm not on Instagram a whole lot. And same with TikTok. I'm there some, and I do videos every once in a while, but I'm generally, if I'm on social media, it's Twitter. So. Okay,
awesome. Well, Thank you very, very much for all your amazing answers. And I'm really looking forward to reading Bioluminescent, a Lunarpunk Anthology, this January.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
And that brings us to the end of episode number 6. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a series embedded within the Solarpunk Futures podcast, written, hosted, and produced by Christina Rocha and Ariel Kroon. This podcast is a part of Solarpunk Magazine, which is published by Android Press, which is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. The opening and closing music for Solarpunk Presents is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol and is available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. So, thank you again for listening, and until the next episode, stay Solarpunk.